People who made a difference, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Did you know that African Americans in the 1950s couldn't go to the same schools as white Americans? On the buses and trains, they had to sit in a different section from white passengers. African Americans had to go to different hospitals and shops, and they couldn't eat in the same restaurants with white Americans. The laws at that time said that Americans were separate but equal, so they had to live separate lives from white Americans. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks was on a bus on her way home from work. When she refused to give her seat to a white man, she was arrested. This was the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. 40,000 African Americans boycotted public buses for over a year. The protest only ended when racial segregation on buses stopped in 1956. This was the beginning of the civil rights movement in the U.S. One of the leaders of the Montgomery bus boycott was Martin Luther King. The civil rights movement wanted African Americans to have the same right to freedom and equality as white Americans. He believed in nonviolent protests and he organized many campaigns against racial discrimination. The police frequently arrested him and sent him to prison, but he continued to protest. In 1963, there was an important civil rights protest in Washington. Martin Luther King spoke to the people about his dream for the future, freedom and equality for all Americans. His speech began with the words, "I have a dream." In 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and in 1965, the American government made it possible for all African Americans to vote. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 1968, and in July 1968, the American government passed the Civil Rights Act, and finally African Americans had the same rights as white Americans.